Imagine the blinding heat of the North African sun, beating down relentlessly on a landscape that feels completely alien. You are a Roman legionary, standing thousands of miles away from the familiar, cool green hills and perfectly paved marble streets of the Republic. You have survived the treacherous crossing of the Mediterranean Sea. You have marched for weeks through unforgiving, deeply arid terrain, and now you stand directly on the edge of the ancient, sacred, and infinitely mysterious River Nile. The air around you is impossibly thick, heavy with suffocating desert dust, and the stagnant, muddy, intensely biological smell of the great river. You are about to step into the ultimate crucible of the ancient world, facing an empire that was already incredibly ancient, already building massive stone pyramids while your ancestors were living in crude mud huts in the very center of Italy. When the average person in the modern world thinks of ancient Egypt, their mind is instantly flooded with Hollywood illusions and deeply romanticized myths. They see magical priests chanting in dark, smoke-filled temples, glowing amulets, mysterious curses written in incomprehensible hieroglyphs, and terrifying gods with the heads of jackals and falcons walking proudly among mortal men. But out here, standing in the brutal, suffocating, and incredibly harsh reality of the ancient battlefield, you know the absolute, unvarnished truth. Magic does not exist. There is no divine intervention waiting to save anyone from the slaughter. There is only tearing flesh, violently shattering bone, splintering bronze, and the cold, pragmatic, intensely unforgiving edge of Roman iron. You are perfectly aware that you are not facing a legion of magicians, ancient sorcerers, or immortal beings summoned from the underworld. You are facing a massive, glittering, and terrifyingly expensive military war machine, funded entirely by the infinite, legendary gold reserves of the Ptolemaic dynasty. Yet, despite their overwhelming, sickening wealth, their exotic weaponry, their terrifying war beasts, and their unwavering belief in their own divine superiority, this golden army is about to be utterly and systematically dismantled by the gray, muddy, mechanical, and entirely emotionless meat grinder of Rome. Before we step forward into the blood-soaked sands of the desert and break down exactly how this historical slaughter unfolded, hit that subscribe button. We uncover history's darkest, most brutal, and most terrifying realities every single week, stripping away the cinematic myths to show you the horrifying truth of ancient warfare. Join the ranks, stand in the line, and let us march into the storm. To truly understand why the Roman military machine absolutely annihilated the massive forces of Egypt, you have to deeply understand the fatal flaw hidden directly beneath all that glittering gold and ceremonial armor. The Roman soldier was not a hero looking for individual glory or personal wealth. He was a heavily armored, highly disciplined cog in a terrifyingly efficient industrial machine, enduring the blistering heat. The Egyptian army of this era was meticulously designed to win battles psychologically, long before a single iron sword was drawn from its leather scabbard, or a single wooden spear was thrown through the violently hot air. Their entire military doctrine and philosophy of war were heavily reliant on extreme intimidation, absolute sensory overload, and the sheer, overwhelming, theatrical display of limitless, untouchable wealth. As the massive Egyptian forces finally marched out across the vast, dusty, sun-baked plains to meet the waiting Romans, the visual and auditory impact was genuinely staggering, strictly designed to completely break the human mind. The entire horizon completely transformed into a blinding, shimmering, undulating sea of highly polished bronze shields, heavily gilded golden armor, incredibly bright, expensive linen garments, and towering exotic beasts that the vast majority of Roman soldiers had never even seen in their entire, deeply pragmatic lives. The dry ground beneath their nailed boots began to tremble violently and continuously under the rhythmic, thunderous, and perfectly synchronized pounding of giant leather war drums, creating a deafening, hypnotic, low-frequency roar that physically washed over the entire battlefield, vibrating deep inside the chests of the waiting men. This intense, calculated acoustic warfare was specifically engineered to make the opposing enemy panic, instantly break their defensive geometric formations, and run away in absolute, uncontrollable animal terror before the actual hand-to-hand fighting even started. At the very center of their massive, glittering, seemingly endless battle line stood the ultimate ancient superweapon, the African war elephant. These beasts were absolutely colossal, heavily armored with thick, shining metal plating, covering their massive heads and vulnerable sides. Their incredibly long ivory tusks fitted with brutal, extremely sharp iron spikes, specifically designed to violently impale multiple armored men at once. On their broad, dark gray backs, they carried thick, heavy wooden towers, firmly strapped to their tough skin, filled to the absolute brim with elite, highly trained Egyptian archers who were totally prepared to rain down a continuous, deadly, suffocating volley of heavy, deeply penetrating arrows from an absolutely untouchable height. To a normal, undisciplined, or poorly trained man, looking up at a rapidly approaching, screaming wall of 3-ton, heavily armored monsters charging forward with a deafening, ear-piercing trumpet sound was more than enough to completely shatter his sanity and instantly break his fragile spirit. Behind this terrifying wall of elephants stood tens of thousands of highly paid, heavily equipped mercenary soldiers. There were veteran Greek hoplites and Macedonian-style phalangites, giant men who were extensively trained to firmly hold massive 18-foot wooden pikes called sarissas. When they lowered these massive pikes in absolute unison, they looked absolutely invincible, forming a literal, impenetrable wall of sharp metal pointing aggressively forward. The Romans, however, simply did not break. They did not violently scatter. They did not drop their heavy iron weapons. And they absolutely did not run away from the glittering, screaming nightmare rapidly approaching them across the sand. When the blindingly bright, incredibly loud Egyptian lines aggressively advanced and the towering, heavily armored war elephants began their terrifying, completely earth-shaking charge across the desert floor, the deeply entrenched Roman legions responded with something far more deeply terrifying than the pounding of heavy drums or the blaring of ancient bronze trumpets. They responded with absolute, dead, suffocating, and profoundly unnatural silence. The legionaries did not scream heroic battle cries at the burning sky. They did not aggressively beat their iron weapons against their shields to make intimidating noise, and they did not show a single microscopic ounce of human panic on their completely weather-beaten faces. They simply tightened their incredibly calloused, heavily scarred grips on the thick leather handles of their massive, heavy, rectangular scutum shields, bent their knees slightly to perfectly lower their center of gravity, dug the sharp iron nails of their heavy military boots deep into the dry dirt, and waited patiently, like coiled springs of iron, for the sharp, piercing, absolutely authoritative whistle of the commanding centurion. The Roman war machine operated exactly like an unfeeling, completely soulless factory, and they looked at the magnificent, golden, seemingly invincible Egyptian army not as a terrifying force of divine, untouchable beings, but simply as a brand new, highly complex logistical problem that urgently needed to be solved through extreme, heavily calculated violence, superior battlefield engineering, and absolute, unbreakable mechanical discipline. The Roman legionary was extensively and brutally trained to fight shoulder to shoulder in a tight, perfectly overlapping, flawless geometric shield wall. This deeply ingrained tactic created a continuous, nearly impenetrable physical shell of thick, hardened wood, incredibly tough leather, and heavy, unyielding iron that could effortlessly absorb a relentless, violently plunging rain of heavy arrows raining down from the towering elephant platforms. While the Egyptian forces completely wasted their precious physical energy violently dancing, shouting aggressively at the top of their lungs, banging heavy drums, and desperately trying to visually intimidate the enemy from a distance under the boiling, utterly unforgiving sun, the Romans stood completely motionless, looking exactly like immovable statues forged entirely from cold, gray iron. They carefully and systematically conserved every single ounce of their physical stamina, breathing slowly, deeply, and rhythmically in the oppressive heat. When the screaming Egyptian war elephants finally closed the violently shrinking distance, the Roman cohorts rapidly executed a chillingly precise tactical maneuver. Without a single human shout, the highly disciplined legionaries simply stepped aside in absolute unison. They created wide, inviting physical lanes straight through the center of their defensive formation. The massive, deeply enraged elephants, animals that are naturally and biologically inclined to seek the completely clear path of least physical resistance, rather than deliberately crashing their massive bodies into a solid, unmoving wall of sharp iron and heavily braced wood, charged blindly and uncontrollably down these suddenly open, deeply tempting, empty corridors. The very moment the massive screaming beasts were completely surrounded and trapped deep inside the belly of the Roman lines, flanked aggressively by silent soldiers on all sides, the centurions finally blew their high-pitched brass whistles. The legionaries closed the brilliant trap instantly, sealing the exits behind the animals with a solid wall of thick, overlapping shields. They violently hurled their heavy, specially engineered iron-tipped javelins, the incredibly deadly pila, with devastating, mechanically practiced force. But they absolutely did not aim for the thick metal armor plates or the heavily reinforced wooden towers on the animals' backs. They specifically, ruthlessly, and highly systematically targeted the incredibly soft, entirely unarmored, and highly sensitive flesh of the elephants' massive bellies, the tender undersides of their thick trunks, and their large, completely unprotected, panicked eyes. The pain inflicted by the plunging Roman iron was instantaneous, absolutely overwhelming, and completely absolute. The terribly wounded, heavily bleeding, deeply confused animals went completely, uncontrollably mad with agonizing physical pain and blind animalistic panic, entirely unable to move forward through the tightly sealed, heavily reinforced Roman traps, The massive beasts violently and abruptly turned around and desperately fled back in the exact direction they had just come from. In their blind, deeply agonizing frenzy to instantly escape the stinging, relentless rain of Roman iron, they crashed directly, headfirst, into their own rapidly advancing, completely unprepared Egyptian infantry lines. It was an incredibly horrific, deeply chaotic, and heavily blood-soaked stampede of loudly crushed human bones, completely shattered, incredibly expensive bronze shields, and unimaginable, deafening human screaming as the absolute ultimate Egyptian psychological superweapon literally and brutally trampled its own highly expensive, glittering army deep into the bloody, completely unforgiving desert sand. With the enemy's absolute greatest psychological weapon completely neutralized and violently turned against them in a matter of violently bloody seconds, the real, deeply terrifying Roman meat grinder finally and officially activated. The Egyptian phalanx desperately pressed forward through the highly chaotic, violently swirling dust, trying frantically to miraculously restore order. But the heavy, curved, incredibly sturdy Roman shields easily absorbed the initial, completely clumsy impact of the long wooden spears. The Roman legionary, keeping his massive scutum shield pulled incredibly tight against his chest, simply stepped inside the long, entirely useless reach of the Egyptian pikes. Using the gladius, they systematically and mechanically dismantled the golden Egyptian line from the inside out with highly calculated, brutal upward thrusts. The blinding white sands of the Nile aggressively drank the spilled blood of ancient kings, and the completely silent, heavily blood-drenched wall of Roman iron stood absolutely victorious, claiming all of Egypt